Okay, we're back with the Messianic Biblical Literature series. This is Awakening Israel, Brother Durrell. So we're going to be looking at the authorship and historicity of the New Testament prophetic writings. So we're also going to look at the New Testament in general, just the authenticity of it. Um, we really want to have some proof in the authorship and historicity of the New Testament writings in order to actually know what we're reading, know what we're believing in. What we've been told about the Holy Bible is a lie altogether. And this is some of the proof of that. We want to look at this. We're going to move through this. It's going to be two different parts to lesson 10. It's a lot of information, so I'm going to try to move through it as quick as I can. The New Testament lacks original authorship. Okay? The New Testament uh, has a lack of knowledge of proof or authorship. And we need to make sure that that is a part of our understanding. How can we follow something if we don't know who wrote it? And then we put our whole faith and trust in it if we don't know who wrote it. So we have a big lack in the proof of authorship. We pulled this from Wikipedia. It says the main article was Synoptic Gospels, and it says authorship is an area of long-standing and current research and debate, with different works posing different problems for identification. While the various works have traditional ascriptions of authorship, these ascriptions are in some cases defended by scholars and in other cases disputed or rejected. So even the Christian scholars are disagreeing with one another. According to many, if not most, critical scholars, none of the authors of the Gospels were eyewitnesses, even explicitly claiming to have been eyewitnesses. This is important. All of this that went on in the New Testament that is written is done without eyewitness testimony. Bart Ehrman of the University of North Carolina has argued for scholarly consensus that most New Testament books were not written by the individuals whose names are attached to those books. He further argues that Gospels were originally anonymous and names were not ascribed to them until 185 AD, 185 years into the new millennia. You know, that has to raise some eyebrows. Other scholars concur. It is the perspective of some writers that none were written in Palestine. So none of these books were written actually in the land of the events. Isn't that interesting? So we're going to take a look at the Bart Ehrman and James White debate that I thought was very good. It was very interesting, and I found so much. This is a part of my research for this lesson. I found so much documentation to back up what the Wikipedia article just said. This authorship and historicity of the New Testament prophetic writings is the name of my lesson, but the name of the debate is is misquoting Jesus or imbalanced history. Does the New Testament manuscript tradition contain the original readings of the books of the New Testament? And we have Bart Ehrman and James White who will debate this issue. And I did go ahead and copy these screenshots and save their actual screenshots so that I could add them into this lesson. So I wanted to give them credit. This debate can easily be found by the previous slide, or you can click this YouTube link below and check the debate yourself. It's quite long. Anyone in the know regarding Christian religious scholars or scholarship knows very well that Bart Ehrman, which is a New Testament and historicity of Jesus critic, and James White, which is a Christian apologist, are two leading biblical scholars. They're authors, theologians in the area of historicity of the Bible and issues pertaining to it. I will be using slides from this debate that can be viewed on YouTube by anyone interested at the link below. The outcome of the debate is not what I found most interesting, but the fact that both critic and apologists completely agreed on the lack of authenticity of the New Testament manuscripts. In order to save time, though, this will be a basic review of the lack of authenticity and reliability of the New Testament manuscripts. So we'll get right into it. So how were manuscripts duplicated during the New Testament era? Now this is starting off with Bart Ehrman. So this is his, these are his slides here. And he says how we got the books of the New Testament. The original text was Mark, right? Now he was the first one to write in the Gospels. Then we had copies of the original, copies of the copies of the copies, and our oldest copy, which is P45, is dated around 220 CE. That's the Christian era. This is way after Jesus Christ, right? Almost 200 years after his death. Our next copy is a 4th century manuscript, so we're in the 300s. That's 300 years after the original. So these are some well-known facts that nobody disputes. Okay, well-known facts. Okay, early manuscripts of the New Testament. So some of these early manuscripts of the New Testament were the Codex Regius, okay, which was around the 8th century. Okay, then you have the Codex Vaticanus as well, both of those around the 8th century. These are Greek manuscripts of the New Testament with strong affinities the Regius had to the Vaticanus. All right, and the main article here was New Testament manuscripts. Like other literature from antiquity, the text of the New Testament was prior to the advent of the printing press, so things were preserved and transmitted in manuscripts. Manuscripts containing at least a part of the New Testament number in the thousands. The earliest of these, like manuscripts containing other literature, are often very fragmentarily preserved. This is Wikipedia. So we usually have fragments that we're working with. Then there's a lot of textual variations and the ever so infamous scribes. Okay, textual criticism deals with the identification and removal of transcription errors in the texts of manuscripts. So ancient scribes made errors or alterations, such as including non-authentic additions. The New Testament has been preserved in more than 5,800 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 manuscripts in various other ancient languages, including Syriac, Slavic, Ethiopic, Armenian. Even if the original Greek versions were lost, the entire New Testament could still be assembled from the translations of 25,200 total manuscripts. I mean, we have so many manuscripts, and then we have a lot of textual variations. We'll look at that later in the lesson. So this is one of them. This is P45. We said we've got 8 chapters of the book of Mark, and the oldest copy is 220 CE. That's about 190 years after the death of Christ. And if we have fragments, doesn't it mean we're missing something? Okay, and look how late that is. They come on the scene so late. I just find it hard to believe personally, and I refuse to believe it, that if there were authentic, eyewitness writings of the life of Christ, that no one would be able to preserve any of the original manuscripts, and we lose all the manuscripts. We even lose the oldest manuscripts, and all we have are copies of copies of copies. This is ridiculous. This faith has just basically taken over the world, and they couldn't even keep their own manuscripts together. I just find that hard to believe. All right, so this mistake is referred to as all manuscripts differ from intentionally, some unintentionally. So we have a lot of errors. Some are intentional and some are unintentional. The kinds of mistakes in the manuscripts, we have accidental, misspellings, parabolous, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, parabolsis, so occasioned by the homo etuliaton. We have serious blunders. So these are some of the areas that errors that are in there. We have intentional alterations, like the woman taken in adultery in John 7:53, 8 through 11. This is an alteration. These are intentional alterations. Also, the last 12 verses of Mark are added. We talked about that in the previous lesson. 9 through 20, 16, 9 through 20 are completely added. The oldest manuscripts do not have those verses. Father, forgive them. That is an alteration. Not even the Son in Matthew 24:36, also an alteration. So we have a lot of problems with the original manuscripts. Bart Ehrman's conclusion is that is the text of the New Testament reliable? And he says there's no way to tell. Remember, there's no original manuscripts. None of them exist. All we have are the 25,000 copies of manuscripts. That's all we have are the copies of copies. See, we've got an error there, so we'll have noticed a few errors, so do forgive that. All right, so we're going to look at Bart Ehrman's conclusions on what he found. He says, my book isn't questioning at all whether God is true or not. The question is whether the New Testament can give us access to the truth of God. And my question is, how can it do so if we don't know the words that were in the Scriptures? What words were in the Scriptures? Another issue that strikes me as a pressing question, one that eventually led me away from the beliefs in the inspiration of the Scripture into viewing the Bible as still a terrifically important and valuable book, but not as delivering the words of God. Another issue, and the reality is there are places where we don't know what the New Testament books said. So if we don't know what they said, how can they be authoritative? Another problem. I thought at one time that God had inspired the very words of the Bible. We actually have thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament in the original Greek language, but most of the copies are hundreds of years after the originals, and they all have differences in them. Isn't that interesting? Bart Ehrman's conclusions continued. These thousands of manuscripts have hundreds of thousands of differences among them. And after a while, I started thinking that it didn't make so much sense to say that God had inspired the words of the text, since it was pretty obvious to me that he hadn't preserved the words of the text, because there are places where we don't know what the text originally said. Isn't that interesting? We don't know what the text said. Okay, so let's just start that over. So this issue here, these thousands of manuscripts have hundreds of thousands of differences among them. And after a while, I started thinking that it didn't make much sense to say that God had inspired the words of the text, since it was pretty obvious to me that he hadn't preserved the words of the text, because there are places where we don't know what the text originally said. That is a very, very important statement right there. Did Jesus get angry at the leper who wanted to be healed? It depends on which manuscript you read. Did he die apart from God? It depends on which manuscript you read. Does the New Testament specifically refer to the doctrine of the Trinity? It depends on what manuscript you read. And did Jesus confront this woman taken in adultery? It depends on what manuscript you read. So it started making less sense to me to think that God had inspired the words, because if he had done the miracle of inspiring the words in the first place, then it seemed like he would have performed the miracle of preserving the words after he'd inspired them. Another very interesting statement. He obviously hadn't preserved them because we didn't have them, and and that made me then doubt the doctrine of inspiration altogether, just like it did myself. And you're looking at a biblical scholar who, changed his views and beliefs based on further research. So that is the end of lesson 10A. We're going to get into 10B, the second half of this debate, shortly.